Good morning, everybody. It's almost 7 a.m. here in the U.S. East Coast, Eastern Time. I'll take this off so I don't blind you because I know that gets annoying. It annoys me too. So it's a little cold this morning, so you bear with me. And Lord knows no one wants the aesthetics of me taking out the flies. All right, so let's move a little bit here. Okay, so today's episode is going to be one of those ones where I do one of my little intellectual wanderings. But let me start this by dedicating the episode to Jules for a very nice email that you wrote me, which I read. And a well placed email, by the way, emphasizing on the importance of where we put Christ in our lives in the center of that. And it was that which kind of led indirectly to today's episode. So let me start by saying what I was doing this morning. Because despite the fact that my enemies like to think I eat little children, in fact, I do something quite different early in the morning. When I can, at least when my mind allows me to, which is not as often as I would like, sadly, if I'm really honest about it, is I read, Christian texts. So I was reading The Glory of Christ by John Owen. And for those who don't know John Owen, just a quick background. John Owen was born in England in 1616 and entered university studies when he was only 12. He became Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, then Vice Chancellor of the university, and he was one of the key figures that actually ended up happening to be the head of the Puritan movement, which, in a generation later would begin settling New England and other places. So, today we're going to talk a little bit about that, and today's show is called Puritan's Pride, American Apostasy, and it goes into how America was lost. And I think it's really important because people don't know the history. We're always talking on this show about what are the causes, why are people this way, and why are that people that way. And you go back and you say, oh, well, this caused this, and you'd be like, oh, yeah, but this happened the generation before that. And so at some point you start thinking, well, when did the decline really start? Where was the problem that happened, and what was the temptation that led America astray? And this is my thesis. If I was out there writing something, that you wouldn't be allowed to write because this is very politically incorrect, but I'll give you the overview of it and then we'll go into the depth of it. The overview of it is the Puritan settlers who came here had a vision of humility and grace where they had a Christ-centered life, and they understood the purpose of a well-ordered life was to create the mind and heart of a servant, much like Jesus had. And if you were to read a book like John Owen's, it would become very clear to you that while they emphasized works as a means of purification, not as a means of self-aggrandizement, which we practice, or as an end unto themselves, because they argued that Christ was too great to be understood through any sort of human action. And so all we could do was approach him through the humility of his own life, and that they went back to the gospel because they looked at 1,500 years of European accumulated tradition, some of it very good and some of it maybe not so much so, especially after the pains of the Inquisition, and said we need to get back to a Christ-centered church, and that's a really good place to be. And what they understood was that, and if you read John Owen, he makes this very clear, what they understood was that they were trying to make a better people by saying, hey, you need to be on the ground level, you need to be living in this way, because the idea was in order for you to have the experience of Christ, you had to exercise faith, and to exercise faith, you had to understand some of the things and give up this world. They talked about dying to this world, so when they make all these rules and these restrictions, which really are the heart of New England, and that's sort of where the rest of it kind of emerged from. The idea was that what they were doing was creating a process of purification without realizing it, because they wanted to have society follow a certain set of rules, and that's why so many people emigrated here. That's why Massachusetts ended up bigger than Maine, or for that matter, Virginia. Not because, Boston's that nice of a place, but because people were committed to it as an act of goodness, and that's what the Mayflower Compact kind of made clear, that this was a dedication to the Lord in that land. So what ends up happening, right, over time is that the apostasy of America is this idea that the works were the good end in of themselves. So it ended up being object-based rather than subject-based. And we talk about this sometimes on the broadcast, where you just got in here. We're just getting into it. So it's okay, and you can pick it back up. The point of today's show is to kind of talk about how America went astray. And we've been starting by saying that the idea was once upon a time people came here with dedication to their faith. All right, we'll pick it up there. And there's a lot more detail, but I'm not going to repeat myself. And you can go back and check it because this will be a good episode, I hope. It's me thinking aloud. It's a little bit more of an egghead. It's a big thought, but I want to get out there because I think it's really important. And for those who like that sort of show, it's good. And for those who want the little details, that's why I do the evening shows for y'all. And we had a good one last night, didn't we? Okay, so where was I? So I was saying that with the American apostasy, what ends up happening is that eventually the idea that we are doing good works, and this is a problem for the Protestant West in general, becomes a works-based logic where the Enlightenment detaches us understanding that we're doing things to learn a better version of ourselves, and the things themselves become an end unto themselves. Empiricism, materialism, God forbid, utilitarianism, and all the sort of socialist doctrines that emerge from that Fabian socialism. You can go down a direct line, from Bacon to Mill to Marx, okay? But the bottom line was that was never the intention of the West. The intention, or at least that was never the intention of the Protestant West. Catholicism has its own issues, and I'm not going to get into that today. They have a different way of looking at some of these things. But the idea was that we were trying to get closer to the Lord. And why do I say that? Because I ended this thing by saying Puritan pride, American apostasy, and divine right. Once upon a time, the regimes in Western civilization were quite stable. They were monarchic, but they were that way because they understood all power ultimately derives from Christ. And that the idea was that if you serve the will of God, that you will be successful. And the Puritans understood this, and they were really successful even in standing against monarchy, because what they said was that we are going to do what's right. We're not going to care overly much for our lives, but what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and learn to value our lives in service to Christ. If he takes us home, it's a victory. If he doesn't, then we're here to do the work, and that we could come forward and live beyond fear of death, beyond fear of material status and pain, and we would build a better society for ourselves. And it worked, by the way. I mean, through will and faith is the only way you ever go forward. But this is the first time in history since the blood of the martyrs, you could say, and even then, that's a narrow group that really comes out and creates an institutionalized Roman religion. But that you see a mass popular sort of religious group end up coming to the fore, and this leads to the English Civil War, to Cromwell, and all that. You get to watch all these funny things, watching sometimes how wonderful and splendid Tudor life was, like all those different shows about Henry are out there, and they show him basically whoring around. But underneath that, there was a deeper current that had spread from Geneva, from people like Calvin and Zwingli up through Luther, of course, and into the English way of looking at things, and that the Puritan church, which emerges, is a real powerful thing, because it's the idea that we are going to seek grace in the highest extent possible, and we are going to seek our closeness to God. So America benefits from this immensely. That's why you see development of New England, and really of what becomes the Northeastern Corridor to develop this. Yes, there's different pieces of it, but ultimately it sort of ends up being two countries merged together, New England and Dixie. And Dixie was kind of the old aristocrats who kind of went along and were happy to just play knights and cavaliers. A lot of them were roundheads, actually, if you go back in time during the English Civil War, and they escaped from there. Conversely, if you look at it from, and you should study the English Civil War, it's worth understanding. It helps with this a lot, actually, to know a little bit about Cromwell and everything that happened in the Star Courts and all that. But anyway, where we are is that we end up seeing that in time what happens is that this strategy leads to wealth and prosperity. And just like you see in the Bible, what ends up happening is that the wealth and prosperity of a people lead to moral degradation. In New England specifically, everyone got hooked on rum, that part of the triangle trade coming through there. And, they'd process the molasses and the various other liquors. I mean, to this day, New England has a pretty strong alcoholic culture. And there have been times, including in the state of Maine, where they banned that altogether because they understood it had problems for people. And we who look at things in this age in light from the process of liberty as don't tell us what to do would find, prohibition horrible. But they, in that time, that looked at liberty as the opportunity to perfect the soul so that one could experience eternal life, looked at that as beneficial. And, my job isn't so much to argue, to be a teetotaler at this point, but what I want to go out there and put is the idea that what happens is moral excellence leads to material wealth. Material wealth leads to moral degradation, which leads to material poverty. And we're at that point in the process where now we're starting to see material poverty, which is not to say that America's poor, far from it. But what happens is that we are all so invested in the wealth that we have lost our sense of anything else. And what that means is that theft and corruption is rampant. And it's sort of hidden in America because our country, being a meritocracy of some extent, sees a lot of the wealth and theft coming from the higher classes, from the people who are well educated, of the poor, where, people get mad on the lower level and be like, oh, this person's getting welfare and I'm not. But fundamentally, corporate welfare, corporate all these things steal a lot more money. So the middle and bottom compete over scraps that are thrown away from the people at the top. And that all happens because you're sort of materialistic and you don't have the idea anymore of how to pull people together. And a lot of that goes back to the pride of the Puritans, where they ended up thinking, and this is where, the Puritan church died and the Congregationalist church and what's it called, the Unitarian church emerged. They started believing the work was the thing in and of itself, and as long as you were helping people, God would be happy with you. But the point was not just to help people. Of course, the Lord would want to help people. The point of doing this was to cultivate in you not a sense of pride that we no longer need God, which is what they've essentially done, or that God is some construct of how we imagine him, but rather to try to emulate the experience of Christ so that you could create this sort of spirit within you where your soul could actually express faith. Because if you don't understand certain concepts, you can't do it. And I'll give you an example. If anyone of you have ever read the Bible, or any difficult book for that matter, you reach a point where, like, as a young person, you read a book and you don't understand certain things. Like, try to have a 15-year-old read Ecclesiastes and get anything from it. You can't, because your life experience doesn't fit. And the Puritans understood that, and they went and did something different. They made a world where the life experiences were designed to go ahead and create a better person. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is why it worked for so long. Because ultimately, what are we trying to accomplish in this world? Let's be real honest about it. We're all going to die. We all know that. And so, are you using this life to cultivate in you a spirit and a soul, where you have something that can go ahead and attach to a world that's more than this? Or are you sinking under the weight of your flesh and your worldly desire? And whether you believe it as an absolute truth, like I do, that this is a spiritual path to heaven that you really have to walk, it's a path of sanctification. And look, my job's not to say who's saved and who isn't, other than to say that in First Corinthians, it makes very clear that you have to profess the Lord Savior Jesus Christ. But even beyond that, you can see the benefits of how it exists on world, because at some point, if you're just doing something for material benefit, which is where all the churches got led into, and it's the American apostasy, right, that materialism leads to a better outcome. But it makes sense because we inherit our Enlightenment legacy that came from Europe, but Europe was tinkering with it as an idea. America adopted it full hog. Now when you look further, New England took it as a full idea, but then we went into secularism full hog. So Enlightenment theory gets played around with England, experimented and used by America. America plays around with secularism and gets adopted by places like California. And so you end up with what you have on the West Coast, and what honestly in a lot of ways migrated across to China and different things that got sort of turned around in ethno-nationalist terms by the Han Chinese. But ultimately, that's where you get sort of these communist ideas that came out of Berkeley and Stanford, that you took something that was good works make better men, except we're not going to have any faith attached to it. We're not going to have anything but material status attached to it, and we're going to put a social order in at all costs. And once you stop having humanity for it, once you start having the idea of a social order without the understanding you're doing this of benefit, that you're having the limitations that grace imposes upon you, that Christ imposed upon himself. Because think about it, if Christ wanted to, theoretically, he could have destroyed the whole world, or he could have left us all to rot, any of those things, and lived a happy life, but he chose not to, because he had a bigger cause that he was fighting for, but it was a good and godly cause, and it was about some degree of restraint. These people don't have that. It was deeds, not creeds, right? There are these problems that are out there. So I share this with you because a lot of people ask me, where did it all go wrong? And, I don't want to just sit there and say, oh, it's this institution or that institution. What I'm saying is we had the wrong formulation from the beginning, and we end with divine right. And why do we end that way? Because yours truly is a monarchist. And what you need is a society that's committed to the idea of making a better person. And I think that's important. I know that's an uncomfortable thing for Americans to talk about, because our whole identity is caught up in rampant individualism. And it's one of the reasons why we're going to have a really nasty war here in the near future, because what's going to happen is our inability to work together. And we'll just say, well, can't we all just get along and do things differently? And everyone who says that's going to be picked off one by one. It's one of the reasons why I live in New England and not the Pacific Northwest or Idaho. With much love for the people out there, but the problem is they're individualists who think that somehow just being in a wild frontier will work, and that's not how stable societies are built. They're built with an understanding that there's a deeper order to it. And up here in the Northeast where we are, there's still I don't want to say a memory. That's too strong. There's like a specter almost. There's like a little glimpse of memory, and not memory. It's like there's an institutional resonance of what the world used to be. And my hope is we can reclaim it, and that's what I work on up here, and that's what I write about sometimes when I'm more lucid. But today was really a rewarding day for me because in reading John Owen, and I didn't read the whole book. It's a heavy book. It's I'm not saying it's super long, but it's just really dense, and there's things that require prayer and require meditation in it. But the idea he had, which I want to share with you today, and I think it's important, is that the glory of Christ is that we can see in his life a pathway whereby we, as fallen beings who are in sin, degradation by our own choice, both in this life and in our inheritance, can find a way to understand the heart of Christ just a little bit, or at least find how should we do it? We can create the longing in ourselves for that world which we want to aspire to. And if you create the longing for that world, you start to realize, and this is what Owen says, that everything in this world that you want and you desire is something that's just death to you. And why do I say that? Because you can't take it with you. You're going to die. And whatever happens when we die, it's abundantly clear that our body isn't a part of it, right? I think we know that. And therefore, we're seeking and searching something bigger in us. And we're seeking to build within ourselves something that can escape this world, this mortal coil. And, how can you do that? You can only do that through faith alone. But we live in a society which has no faith or bad faith. We have faith in our ability to cheat death. And everything we do comes back to this idea that somehow through material status, we're going to go ahead and cheat death. Either we're going to go ahead and God's going to say, hey, we're going to reward you and take you into heaven because you were a good person. And everyone says, well, I'm going to heaven. I'm a good person. When it was never really about that. It was, you're not a good person. None of us are good people. And we can't be. And there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not a good person. We're sinners. It's the humility that comes from that and the recognition of what we can't do that was liberating because it made us better people. When we think we are a happy end unto ourselves, when we think every one of us is a God in his own being, like the Gnostics would teach, that's how you lose your ability to connect, because you are basically committing a gross act of blasphemy and idolatry of saying that you can reach that level. Conversely, if you go out there with humility and you try to emulate the life of Christ, and what happens, you end up with a better way. That's the meekness that the Bible talks about. And look, it doesn't mean people deserve to beat you up. It doesn't mean that you have to give up what you care about, but it means that you orient your life properly so that you can understand what you're doing, because you're either advancing yourself, your being, and from that civilization emerges, because what is civilization if not discipline against one's own desire? That's all it is. Anything else is barbarism. Or conversely, you go forward and you say, okay, we're going to indulge, and then you end up in violence and decadence, and you end up, creating the gladiator games again. You end up creating what happened to Rome and why it fell, and people blame that on Christianity. Gibbon did, but the reality is Rome fell because it was too caught up in its own decadence. And all empires do this, and America is an empire. We are at the point now where we are breaking, and moreover, I make the argument, and it's not popular, but it's true, that it should be breaking because we're not good. You can't be great if you're not good. And look, when you become great, you lose the ability to be good. It's inevitable. This is the cycle of history, right? Every one of these things happens this way. But we are now going to be the times, where we're going to have hard times are going to create better men. And what I would suggest is that even though the odds of fighting what's out there seems impossible, that our way to understand this battle and the chance we have begins with orienting our moral compass properly. That we need to seek to, quote, rise above. But when I say rise above, it's not we like everyone and we get along with everyone or some secular thing. It's that we literally ask God and repentant, humble, on knees, say, God, lead us to a better way. Because he did it. It happened over and over again in history, and there's plenty of miraculous things. And the idea that we have that God doesn't care about history is kind of, it's peak vanity, and that's what it comes down to. But it's the pride of people say, we've created the perfect world, now we don't need you anymore. And the whole point of creating a better world was to express just how much we needed Christ. And I needed to be reminded of that. And I'm grateful for what Jules wrote and how that made me think, and also for the many efforts of my wife, because I lose my connection to Christ easily. And why does that happen? Because the world is awful and there's people in it doing rotten things. We're out there doing big work. Check out the Free States Project at telegramT.me/Free States if you're curious. I'll talk about it more on my evening shows, but today isn't about that, so we're not going to talk about that. what we're going to talk about is how the reclamation happens in that American apostasy, that we're talking about. Because you can see what happens is that wealth makes Americans give up their principles. We all began fighting over control over power in the center, and we gave away. I mean, even look at like the direct election of senators, right? Populism. We want to have a greater say in our future. Well, great, but you destroyed your ability of states to have any things, and you created the parties even worse than Washington warned about. It was sort of inevitable, and we got led into every war. And America wasn't supposed to be a warlike people. The Puritans and the Amish and all these people who came here, they were looking for a pacific lifestyle, but yet wealth made them violent. And if you ask people around the world how they see Americans, they see us as people who go out there looking for a fight all the time. And I don't want to say I oppose all fighting. I don't think that's the case. But I'm saying that we look at our solution generally as shoot first and ask questions later, and that sort of thing is just so destructive to a society because we don't know what we're about, and that's where the apostasy comes in. We say, oh well, whatever's good for the most people, right? That's what we say. We say this utilitarian answer, but what ends up happening is that we have 100 different solutions to that, and that ultimately we end up fighting over those because no one can tell us what to do, and we just don't know ourselves. And I hope and I pray that we begin to. I don't think we can know ourselves. I think that moment's past, for reasons. But I think to reinvent ourselves, in regions and nations, and here in New England, that's why I read Puritan history and I look at it. It's a remembrance of the fact that we were doing so on a Christ-like basis. That was why we started Free States Project. I didn't put an ideological thing on it, even though I read and see the things the far lefties like to say about me all the time. That's fine. They can say whatever they want. But the thing is, I'm out here talking to everyone. I'm talking to my enemies. I'm walking a path that I think is closer to Christ than they are. And it's not about comparative things. It's about me trying to learn how to love people who hate me. It's about us learning to overcome difficulties between one another so that we have an option where we can actually come together when people who have pledged themselves to evil. And that's what we have, by the way, our elite class. There are materialists who are seeking power, and like Faust, they've made their bargains where they will do anything and everything required to be successful, to be wealthy. I mean, and just look at popular culture. Look at this. I mean, they do it jokingly. They say, oh, the Illuminati, they do the eye thing all the time and all that. And I'm not doing that to show you that. I'm showing you what they do. But all of those things happen again and again. And why do they do that? They do that because they are making their pledge and commitment that they are choosing death to have comfort in this life. They want to choose life in this world. They want to choose their body over their soul. And that's ultimately the choice each and every one of us will have to make. And I think, honestly, that's what this is all about in the end. Tribulation, if you read the Bible, if you read Revelation, is about a question, and it's different for every generation. Who knows when the final end comes, right? But it's about the question of, will you choose to die to this world to live for something greater? Will you have faith in God enough to do that? Or will you say, I'm going to make whatever sacrifices and compromises are required with this world? And of course, day to day, we have to make choices because we're here to do the work. The Apostle Paul writes very well about that. But we ultimately are going to have to make a choice. If you're someone who believes the vaccine is a problem, if you believe integrated human technology, a chip in your hand, a chip in your head, one or the other, soon you'll be dead. These sort of things are coming down the line, and we see that governments are not in a idea what they're not going to push things through to be more mandatory. Patriot Act 2 is already coming, and they're saying everything that's. I mean, let's be blunt. They're going to say that all guns are bad, all white people to blame, and that if you try to stand against this, you're a terrorist. And that's what's going to be said, and a lot of people are going to be hurt by this. If it gets even worse, and I suspect it shall, a lot of people will be killed by it. And then the question is, what do we do? And people look at it as a strictly secular problem, but it's also a moral problem. It's a moral problem where we are fighting immoral actors, and if we fight immoral actors with just immoral means, we will fail. And we have to figure out a way to have a moral argument that we're putting together, and that's one of the things we kind of do with this within the Free Atlantic Nation. It's why grace is one of the four core values, because you have to start cultivating that grace and the ability to understand something beyond yourself, and the idea that individual versus collective is not the battle that we want to be fighting. We want to be fighting the battle of good versus evil. And what's the battle of evil? The battle of evil is when you think vice is virtue, and when you think you have all the solutions, and when you think that 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 man can solve all his problems. I mean, it takes a little bit of humility, it takes a little bit of patience and an understanding. And look, it's hard, it's miserable. I would love to go out there and on one hand play tyrant, but a monarch isn't a tyrant, and that's a conflation that was done. Divine right of kings was about the fact that people were favored by God, and they talk about this in the book of Romans a little bit, and that therefore those things were there. We had a king. Trump was a king, and he was a poor king. He was, people thought that he was going to be the Cyrus, and so to this point, he's been a Nebuchadnezzar, but maybe something better will come along eventually. Certainly not in Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, but nonetheless, we might see something. And as we see leaders emerge in this, and as we see people taken down, I mean, we got to go out there, and people who have different visions have to say that. And my vision is of an America with lots of smaller countries where they actually have to listen to the people because we don't have an empire to defend, because we don't want it. I don't want war with China. I don't want war with Middle East. I don't want to occupy half the rest of the world. I would like to unite parts of us with Canada, but I see our future as 6 to 10 different nations that, will have a different chance to connect. And if at least one of them can find their way to God, in the same way that, you might have seen Joseph eventually redeem his brothers despite the awful things they've done to him, we need a place for something good to emerge again. And I've made my bet that it could be New England, but hey, maybe it's our friends in Texas. Maybe they got something good going on. Or maybe Dixie will reclaim its Baptist roots from a church that's getting socialized in much the same way that the Unitarians socialized the Puritans. Or maybe the Quebecois will be the leaders. Who knows them? But civilization needs a space to renew, and empires are not an opportunity to do that. Thank you, Norman. I appreciate that. And maybe it'll come from the Northwest, and maybe it'll be the interaction. A lot of people who study history think Europe succeeded because you had lots of small states with lots of efficacy in close communion with one another, and it was the competition between them that made them to adopt best habits. A lot of people also see the United States much the same way, that we had 50 different states, or at different times different numbers, but that these states would explore different ideas, and that they would adopt good ideas from bad ideas. And maybe it ends up being the Mittelreich, across what would you call it, New Prussia, that maybe goes from Ohio or maybe Western Pennsylvania all the way across. That's possible. I mean, and like I'm saying, my job is not to tell you the exact visions. My vision is for my Atlantic homeland. My love is there, and it's something we want to see. And Joe, let me say this: if you want to start a Nevada group, man, if you're over there, just send me one. I'll help you set it up. It's really not a lot of work once you get it started. It takes about 5 minutes, and we could set up a free Nevada or free Washington or free any of the other states. I am looking for people to do that, but we are trying to get different states to start talking and thinking this way. And then organically, I suspect what we will find is different states will work together. New England and the Mid-Atlantic will work together. I already know that because I've been heavily involved with it. The Midwest will work together. Dixie will work together. Texas will do its own thing in its periphery. The Mountain West has some pieces that it wants to do. And the Pacific Coast and California is complicated. They got like 5 or 6 states, but maybe that's the way it is. Maybe California is a lot like how Renaissance Italy was, where Venice was the one. There were the 5 great cities of Italy, right? There was Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, and Rome, and they would fight for control over one another. And eventually, they fought so much that the Spanish and the French conquered them. But that's the way that goes sometimes, and maybe that'll go here too. But I think it'd be better if we could do something different. And then, I say with humility to the people who don't agree. There are lots of different places, and it would be easier to move lines and move people between and do those sort of things. But I mean, at the end of the day, I will tell you who's going to succeed. Who's going to succeed is whomever decides to get closest to Christ. And that's one of the things that will be a challenge, because especially up here in New England is the least Christian area of America. The 4 least Christian states, least churchgoers, are not in this necessarily this order, but are Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. And why should that be? One reason is I think people here are smart enough to realize the church has been heavily corrupt. There was the Boston Catholic scandals as one part of it, but also the fact that if you go into your average Unitarian church or Congregationalist church, what they teach could be taught as easily on like PBS. They don't actually believe in God anymore, or at least they don't believe in a God that fits the biblical definition of one. I mean, and to me, that's not believing in God. That's believing in your own humanity as divinity, and you talk about worship of the goddess and all these things. I mean, pure rank heresy. But those things need to be fought. But I think the fact that people have recognized how broken it is, offers an opportunity for what might be a new awakening, and that has to be part of what we do. And it's hard because on the one hand, we're going to have a lot of really ugly, difficult things coming forward. There's going to be fights, there's going to be violence, and these things are sort of inescapable at this point, in my opinion. However, there's also the opportunity for, in that terrible time, that there's going to be a reckoning where people will reawaken. And moral leadership often comes from, when you're doing nation building, the idea you're building that identity. So all of these groups we're building are the first effort in trying to help people not just share, notes and intel with each other, but build mutual support networks and realize that they don't have to look to the center for answers. And we have strength for that because the center is the point of oppression. It always is. I mean, think of it from the earth, right? The earth exerts gravity. You're at the center of things. It's just pulling you down. And we don't need to be pulled down. We need to be lifted up. What's at the center of earth but a hot, molten, burning ball? It's amazing how reality, if you really look at it, replicates, theology. There was a reason it was understood as the queen of sciences once, because it was understood properly as the means of awakening the being within inside someone, to awaken the soul from the body. But we have been put into a slumber, and much like Rip Van Winkle, we need to awaken. So that's my message for today that I wanted to put out there. A little bit of sermon, a little bit of history, but it's important to ask big questions, like that. And yeah, you're right, Joseph. It's absolutely true. You've been doing great work with Kentucky. Thank you. You guys may or may not know this, but I'm actually in every group, and I will say, opening my Telegram in the mornings is a task. They had 800 messages in the Texas group. That's the fastest growing one. Although we're doing pretty good in Maine. I'm pretty happy. I think it's sort of, we're not going to keep up with Texas, and I'm not trying to. Our job is not to beat the Texans. Our job is to run our own race, and that's what we have to do, and to be good and faithful servants. And look, it's I don't know what's going to be. It's a project, right? It was an idea whose time obviously had come because people are running for it. So we'll see what happens. But I'm excited for it, and we'll see what happens in the days ahead. I think that people are going to need other options, and I think eventually we're going to need people who will do a lot more than this. I mean, what's going to happen is leadership's going to have to come from men who say, we're not going to be a part of this, and resistance will have to be offered. And, violent resistance has problems, but realistically, if the government starts committing violence, proportionality comes into play. And I think that's coming. But I think people have to be smart and have to be patient, and we need better leadership. So hopefully some of these shows that I put out there, they're all about that, and about knowing why we're doing the things we're doing. And it's one of those things you don't really ever wish to be born into a time like this, even though something amazing can happen. But I'm reminded of what John Adams said, that you'll never know the price that we paid for what we've given you. And I think that that's true, actually. It's interesting, you listen to things, and it's like listening to, I have this vision, of like what it would have been like living in Rome right before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and the fights between Caesar and Pompey and all that. And they were saying, oh, the no good Senate was just looking out for themselves. And the elites have always ever done such a thing. But people can do something different if we are willing to be parts of new nations. And the easiest way for people to do it is to start thinking of their states and of their regions. So for my friends in Dixie, I hope that you remember the time has come again. For, of course, my friends in New England, it's time for us to remember ourselves. And for those who are out there in the West and in other places, this is an opportunity for you to define yourselves. You were given a heritage. There's good things in there and there's bad things in it. Your parents had a problem. New England and Dixie made a really weird combination. Didn't necessarily work that well. Would have been different. Maybe if the one-sided one, who knows. But you have to deal with it, and you're gonna have to put it together. And what I would suggest is you look at what your parents didn't give you for the chance for how you should go forward in the future. And for us, we have to look at what we forgot our old great grandpa that was muttering about somewhere over there on the coast, and that's where our future is. So. Let me close with a little prayer for each of you. I hope you have a good day. And when I come on in the morning, it's just because I have a big idea I want to put out there, and I don't know what I'm going to do today, but because it's hard. I mean, it's just, you look at these things out there, and for me, I write books, I talk about things, and I share my ideas as they come up. But it's hard to write anything right now because I don't know what I'd say. I don't know what to tell you other than what I'm thinking in the moment. And that's why it's a good time to go look and pick up Bibles and try to find a way to get closer to Christ. And for me, the gospel, I've read it so many times that you can always get something new from it, but sometimes it helps to look from the outside, and sometimes reading commentaries helps a little bit. So I think I'm going to be doing that for a little bit while I'm not reading books about Atlantic history, because Lord knows I have at this point I have like an insane library of Canadian and American history, but it's a lot of fun. Maybe I'll have to have some people down because can't just have difficult things, and we have to find some hope for ourselves. That's the other thing. So find that for yourself. So let's make that the prayer for today. Heavenly Father, we know that in you is the hope for all humanity. So, those of us who are out here asking questions, we ask that you use this world as an opportunity to refine us, but also bring us closer to you. And in bringing us closer to you, bring this kingdom closer to your kingdom so that we may not suffer so much, but instead may find the path to you for each and all mankind. So, I just pray that in the Lord's name. Amen. You guys all have a great rest of your morning. I hope that, it's a good one. It looks like it's snowing out the window here in Maine, so I suspect yours truly is not going to be doing much more than reading or maybe a little bit of moderating. If you aren't in the Free States Project, https colon backslash t.me/free states. Get in there. It's good stuff. You can always find me also at Atlantic Homeland, which is separate because if you're going to go full on secessionist like I have, why not, right? Because our government's a sad version of itself. And we'll just keep on talking. We're building it slow. I'm okay with that. I like sustainable growth, and I like that when people come in on this, they know what they're doing. And for the rest of you who just like listening to me talk, I hope you enjoy. And for those of you who don't like listening but get paid to do it, maybe you ought to reawaken something in yourself. Look in the mirror a little bit. Maine, 9 months of winter, 3 months of darn poor dog sledding. You ain't kidding. Although actually, you should be saying black flies and skeeters because that's true life in the Mainer. But hey, you know what? I am always mad and plaid, and I'm gonna get back to my book. So I'll see you when I see you. Definitely will see you Friday evening, absent something terrible. And don't be surprised if I don't pop up here and there as it makes sense. So God bless, and each of you have a very good day.